When you think of ancient poetry, you probably think of, I don't know, pleasant aesthetics.
Right, yeah, like abstract metaphors.
Yeah, imagery involving flowers, clouds, fleeting feelings. But what if a poem was actually a highly technical blueprint for a biological trap?
That changes things quite a bit.
It really does. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are setting aside the standard discussion format today because we're taking a deep dive into a very specific stack of source material.
And this one is custom tailored for you.
Absolutely. You're the kind of listener who wants to understand the rigorous, like nuts and bolts mechanics of biblical translation and exegesis, but without getting lost in the dense academic jargon that usually, well, kind of gatekeeps this kind of knowledge.
Yeah, we want to strip all that away today.
Right. So our mission is to unpack the Net Bible First Edition notes by Biblical Studies Press. We're zeroing in on the translation, the textual notes, and the study notes for Psalm 5.
Specifically looking closely at verses 6 through 12.
Yeah. And then we'll look over the edge into the opening of Psalm 6 to witness the immediate aftermath. Because the source material today, it presents a really jarring reality.
It's not what you'd expect from a psalm.
No, not at all. It suggests that ancient Hebrew poetry doesn't just use metaphors to sound pretty. It constructs these visceral, terrifying physiological traps. I mean, we're talking about equating a human throat to an open grave.
It's intense imagery.
And alongside that biological warfare, the text uses highly specific Hebrew verb tenses to reveal God's typical ongoing reactions to human deceit. It is graphic, it's grammatical, and it's entirely gripping.
It really is. And the grammatical structure here, it forces us to, slow down our reading pace. We can't just skim past the imagery, assuming we already grasped the point.
Right, like we usually do.
Yeah, the notes from the Net Bible demand that we analyze the precise mechanics of how these traps are set in the text, and more significantly, how the divine responds to the people setting them.
So it's definitely not casual reading.
Not at all. The translators have left this trail of breadcrumbs in their notes that reveal a highly sophisticated ancient worldview, one where language itself is viewed as a physical force.
Wow, language as a physical force. Let's start right there, actually, because before the text even allows us to consider the psalmist finding protection, the notes force us to confront the threat itself, right?
Yeah, the threat and the divine reaction to it.
Which takes us into verses 5 and 6. So the text references, quote, all the workers of wickedness and a man of bloodshed and deceit. The translation notes provide some really crucial details about how the Hebrew language handles the concept of collective wickedness. You have this phrase, a man of bloodshed.
Right, and if we look at the Hebrew syntax there, we see something deliberate and highly stylized happening. The source material specifically addresses that phrase, a man of bloodshed and deceit. The Hebrew word used there is ish.
Which translates literally to man, right?
Yes, man. It's a singular noun. But the surrounding context in verses 5 and 6 features plural forms. The text talks about the workers of wickedness and those who speak a lie.
So you have these plural groups surrounding a singular noun. It almost feels like a grammatical mismatch when you first look at it. Like, why drop a singular man into a crowd of plural workers?
Well, the notes clarify that this singular ish is used in a collective or representative sense. That's why translating it as people or viewing it as a collective entity is the right approach for the translator.
Oh, okay.
The psalmist isn't pointing a finger at one specific individual standing across the street. By using the representative singular, the text creates a universal archetype of wickedness.
I see.
It takes the entire plural group, all the individuals causing harm, and compresses them into a single, highly focused avatar.
It makes me think of how we use phrases like the enemy or, the taxman in modern English.
Yes, precisely.
You use a singular term to describe an entire category of people who operate in a specific way. It takes a faceless crowd and gives it a recognizable profile. You aren't worried about 500 random people, you're worried about the man.
That's a really accurate parallel. It distills the plural group down to a single, unified profile. When you read a man of bloodshed and deceit, the text presents a concentrated version of the wicked.
Right.
It focuses the reader's attention on the specific traits that define this entire group of people. By making it singular, the text forces you to look the threat right in the eye, rather than letting it remain this vague, blurred crowd in the background.
And one of those defining traits, the thing you're forced to look at, is how this archetype uses language. The translators provide a note that completely redefines what we assume when we hear the word lie.
Yeah, that note is fascinating.
The text states, those who speak a lie. Now, in a modern Western context, a lie is usually just a factual error, right? It's a failure to correspond to reality. If I tell you it's raining and it's actually sunny, I lied. It's a philosophical misstep.
Right. We tend to view truth through a very Greek philosophical lens. Truth is an accurate statement of facts. Therefore, a lie is an inaccurate statement of facts. But the ancient Near Eastern mindset, and specifically the Hebrew mindset, is far more relational and covenantal.
Right, and the notes make it clear that in the Old Testament, a lie isn't getting a trivia question wrong. It's not misremembering a date. The translators specify that a lie refers to a slanderous or deceitful statement that promotes one's own selfish, sinful interests and exploits or harms those who are innocent.
It's an active weapon.
Well, yeah, it really is. And here's where it gets really compelling. The note points out the connection to violence and deceit in the very next line. They're paired together. This isn't a slip of the tongue. This is weaponized language. It's perjury designed to steal a farm. It's a fabricated rumor intended to ruin a rival's livelihood.
The source material draws a hard line connecting deceit directly with exploitation. The lie is an active mechanism of harm. It is not a passive failure of memory. When the text talks about a man of bloodshed and deceit, it intertwines physical violence with verbal deceit. The words are the tools used to achieve the bloodshed, or the words themselves constitute a kind of violence against the innocent.
Which makes sense in that culture.
Absolutely. In an ancient agrarian society, your reputation and your standing in the community were tied to your survival. A slanderous lie could lead to you losing your land, your status, or even your life in a rigged legal proceeding.
So we have this archetype of wickedness, this singular representation of people who weaponize language to exploit others. And the massive question hovering over all of this is, how does God react to this?
That is the big question.
The translators address this by highlighting the Hebrew imperfect verbal form. They spend time dissecting the verbs used for God's reaction.
This is a crucial point in understanding the theology embedded in the grammar. In English, we are obsessed with time. Past, present, future, everything is locked onto a timeline. But ancient Hebrew verbs are highly focused on aspect. They care about whether an action is complete or incomplete. The imperfect verbal form, as the notes detail, indicates an incomplete or continuous action. In this specific context, it reveals God's typical response or characteristic attitude towards such individuals.
Meaning it's not just something he did once yesterday or might do tomorrow. It's not an isolated incident on a timeline.
No, it reveals an ongoing settled disposition. So when the text says God destroys or hates these workers of wickedness, the imperfect tense tells us that this is his characteristic stance.
Oh, I see.
He doesn't have a one-off emotional reaction. He doesn't wake up in a bad mood and suddenly decide to be angry at deceit for the afternoon. His opposition to exploitation, his hatred of weaponized language, is a continuous, unchanging reality.
That is a very stabilizing thought. If you're the victim of slander, if someone is using lies to steal your livelihood, you want to know how the judge of the universe feels about it. And the grammar says, his reaction isn't volatile. It's a settled law of the universe. It's as reliable as gravity. Gravity always pulls down. God always opposes the deceitful.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, the notes do offer an alternative translation, pointing out that the verb can be translated as a future tense, you will destroy.
Okay, so looking ahead.
Right. In that case, the psalmist is envisioning a specific future time of judgment when God removes the wicked from the earth. But even if you take the future translation, the root of that future action is this characteristic attitude.
Because it's who he is.
Yes, the ongoing disposition against violence and deceit guarantees the future destruction of it. The future event is just the inevitable result of the present continuous character of God.
Okay, let's unpack the tension this creates. We've established this incredibly raw, objective reality. God has a characteristic ongoing attitude of destroying the deceitful and the violent. That is a terrifying baseline reality for the universe.
It really is.
If God's default posture is the destruction of wickedness, the natural question is how anyone survives it all. We all have moments of deceit or selfishness. The text answers this survival question in verse 7 with a sharp grammatical pivot.
The transition in verse 7 is visually and grammatically striking. The translation notes break down the syntax for us. The verse begins with the phrase, "but as for me."
Which seems pretty standard in English, but it's different in Hebrew, right?
Yeah, in Hebrew, the standard word order usually places the verb first, followed by the subject. But here, the first-person pronoun is placed at the absolute beginning of the verse, before the verb.
So by shoving me to the front of the sentence, it disrupts the normal flow of reading. It acts like a sudden camera pan in a movie. You're staring at this terrifying archetype of wickedness, you're looking at God's settled disposition to destroy them, and then whip hand the camera snaps over to the solitary figure of the psalmist. But as for me...
That's spot on. The syntax dictates the meaning.
Mhm.
Fronting that pronoun highlights a massive contrast between the destiny of the evildoers we just discussed and the posture of the psalmist. It's as a stark dividing line drawn in the sand using grammar. The psalmist is actively separating himself from the archetype of wickedness.
And what is the psalmist's posture once he separates himself? The notes say the psalmist expresses confident entry, "I will enter your house." In stark contrast to the evildoers who face destruction and rejection, the psalmist is totally confident that God will accept him into his presence.
But the key is how he enters.
Right? The notes introduce a literary device here called metonymy, which completely changes how we read the next phrase.
The phrase in question is, in fear of you. The Hebrew noun is yirah, which means fear. The translation note explains that when this word is used in the context of fearing God, it is sometimes used metonymically for what it ideally produces: worship, reverence, and piety.
Okay, I want to challenge this idea for a second. Why use metonymy here? If the goal is to describe worship or reverence, why does the text use the word for fear instead of just saying worship directly? It feels like an unnecessary hurdle for the reader to jump over. Why code the language?
That raises a great question about the mechanics of metonymy itself. Metonymy is a figure of speech where a thing or concept is called not by its own name, but by the name of something intimately associated with it.
Like, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Yeah, or think of how news anchors say, the White House announced today. The building didn't speak, the president's staff did, but the association is so tight that the building stands in for the staff. The source material points out the cause and effect relationship happening with the word fear.
So the fear causes the worship.
Right. The raw, objective reality of God's judgment against the wicked, that characteristic attitude of destruction we just analyzed, it creates a very specific emotional and psychological reaction in a human being. It creates a holy terror and overwhelming awe. That initial shock is the yirah.
So the fear is the starting line.
The fear is the necessary catalyst that produces acceptable worship and reverence. You cannot have genuine reverence without first grasping the terrifying reality of God's absolute opposition to wickedness.
Wow, that makes sense.
By using the word fear metonymically for worship, the text refuses to let you separate the two concepts. It forces you to remember the weight of the divine presence. You don't casually stroll into the house of the God who characteristically destroys the violent.
Definitely not.
You enter because of his provision, and your reaction to his holiness is a visceral fear that blossoms into piety. If the text just said worship, we might think of a casual song. By saying fear, it anchors the worship in the reality of God's immense, dangerous holiness.
So entering the house of God is this incredibly secure moment. You've crossed the threshold, you're accepted. The fear has turned into worship. But the deep dive does not stop there, because the psalmist can't stay inside the sanctuary forever. Life requires movement.
He has to go back outside.
Right. He has to walk back out into a dangerous world. This necessitates a shift from asking for acceptance inside the house to asking for guidance outside on the road. This brings us right into verse 8.
The geographic and psychological shift in verse 8 moves from the sanctuary out onto the open road. The translator notes introduce us to the concept of God's providential leading. The Hebrew word here is tzedakah, which is almost always translated as righteousness.
Right, righteousness.
But the note provides a very specific context for how this word functions here.
It's not just a static moral attribute. When we hear righteousness, we usually think of God sitting in heaven, being morally perfect, never telling a lie, never doing anything wrong. We think of a pristine record.
The note specifies that his tzedakah includes the deliverance that originates in his righteousness. He protects and vindicates the one whose cause is just. So in this context, righteousness is an active, defensive action on behalf of the innocent. It is God's moral perfection mobilized for rescue.
It's kinetic. It's righteousness on the move. And this active deliverance is desperately needed because of the environment waiting outside the sanctuary. The translators point out that the psalmist is asking for this leading because of those who watch me. And the note adds a chilling bracketed context. with evil intent.
The environment is utterly hostile. You have a watchful enemy tracking the psalmist's movements. Because the enemy is watching, calculating, and waiting, the psalmist makes a very specific request in verse 8, which leads us to a fascinating textual note about the preservation of the Hebrew Bible itself.
This part is amazing. The request is, make level before me your way. And here is where the source material pulls back the curtain on how these ancient texts were actually handed down through history. The note says the imperative make level is hifil in the kethib, which is the consonantal text, but it is peel in the queer, which is the marginal reading.
This gives us a rare window into textual criticism and the scribal tradition. In the ancient Hebrew text, only the consonants were written down on the scrolls. The vowels were supplied by the reader based on a strict oral tradition.
So you really had to know the text to read it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, you couldn't just sound it out. Over time, groups of scribes, known as the Masoretes, developed a system of vowel pointing to preserve the precise pronunciation of the oral tradition. They wanted to ensure no one forgot how the words were supposed to sound.
But they ran into a massive problem when the oral tradition clashed with the written ink.
Yes, they did. Sometimes the oral tradition, what was read aloud in the synagogues for centuries, differed slightly from the written consonants they had inherited on the scrolls. But because the written consonantal text was considered so sacred, they refused to alter a single letter on the page. They would not erase or change the ancient ink.
That is an incredible level of meticulous care. They spot a discrepancy, and instead of just, fixing it like a modern editor would, they build a system to preserve the tension.
So they created the Kethib Quer system. Kethib means what is written, referring to the ancient consonants in the main body of the text. Quer means what is read. When there was a discrepancy, they left the Kethib consonants right where they were in the text.
Unchanged.
But they took the vowel points belonging to the Quer, the word that was supposed to be read aloud, and superimposed them onto the Kethib consonants. Then they wrote the actual Quer consonants in the margin of the scroll. It was their way of saying, this is what is written, but this is what you should say.
So in this specific instance, in Psalm 5, the Kethib has the word in the hifil stem, and the Quer has it in the peel stem. Without getting bogged down in the minutiae of Hebrew verb conjugations, what's the practical takeaway for the person reading this deep dive regarding the phrase, make level before me your way? What does the difference in stems actually mean for the sentence?
The core concept remains consistent, regardless of whether you read the peel or the hifil stem. It's an urgent request for God to clear the path. The note clarifies that God's way here is the way in which he leads the psalmist providentially.
Ah, okay.
The act of righteousness we discussed earlier is being applied directly to the road ahead. The psalmist is asking God to exercise his providential will to flatten the obstacles.
It makes me think of a massive snowplow clearing a treacherous mountain pass in the middle of a blizzard. The way belongs to the plow. It's the plow's route. It's a massive, unstoppable force pushing through the snow and ice. That represents God's providential will and his act of deliverance.
That's a vivid picture.
Right, but the leveling of the road benefits the small car following closely behind. The psalmist is the car in this analogy. He's asking God, take your massive providential force and drive it through this hostile environment so that the path I'm forced to walk on is leveled and safe. He needs God to take the lead because the road is impassable otherwise.
The analogy fits perfectly with the context of the passage. The psalmist needs that path leveled because the hostile environment is not just an abstract idea of hardship. The enemies are actively constructing targeted obstacles.
Biological traps.
Yeah. This transitions us right into verse 9, where the text reveals why the path is so lethal and why a providential snowplow is the only hope of survival.
This is where we hit the visceral hook we talked about at the beginning of the show. The enemies have constructed a hidden, lethal trap, and they're using only their biology and their vocabulary to do it. The source material provides an absolute masterclass in Hebrew metaphor here, breaking down the anatomy of an open grave.
We start with a note that establishes the baseline reality of these enemies, the total absence of truth. The text reads, "For there is not in his mouth truthfulness."
His mouth, singular again.
Right. The translator note clarifies that the singular pronoun his refers back to the representative man of bloodshed we analyzed in verse 6. It acts as a collective for the plural they in the very next line. This grammatical link ties the entire passage together. The archetype of wickedness from verse 6, the one who weaponizes language, is the exact same entity setting the trap here in verse 9.
And the subsequent notes give us the gruesome anatomy of this trap. It's the anatomy of Sheol. Let's break down the physical components the text lists. It says their inward parts are destruction, their throat is an open grave, and they make smooth their tongue, which the notes explain means using flattering or deceitful words.
To understand the terrifying force of this imagery, we have to understand what Sheol represented in the ancient Near Eastern mind.
Which was the underworld, right?
Oh, yes. The notes detail an extended metaphor comparing the enemy's anatomy to the realm of death itself, Sheol. Sheol was envisioned as a dark, cavernous region deep within the earth. The entrance to this underworld was the grave, which was characterized by steep, slippery slopes leading down into the darkness.
So, if we synthesize this step by step based on the source material, we can build the trap. The enemy's tongue is the steep, slippery slope, the flattering words.
Okay.
The innocent victim steps on this flattery, thinking it's a compliment, and loses their footing. They slide down this slope into the throat, and the throat, biologically and visually, resembles a dark, deep chasm. It's the open grave. And this fall terminates in the stomach or the inward parts, which represents Sheol and utter ruin.
That's the progression.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the progression of this biological trap. Are the thoughts the motive, the throat, the physical execution, and the tongue the bait?
That synthesis aligns completely with the translator notes. The notes explicitly state that the enemy's inward part refers to their thoughts and motives, which are entirely destructive in their intent. That motive is the engine driving the entire trap.
Wow.
The throat is the location where these destructive thoughts are vocalized, transformed from silent malice into physical sound waves. And the tongue is the instrument used to deliver the bait. It delivers the deceitful, smooth words that cause the innocent victim to lose their footing and slide into demise.
It's terrifying because the trap is completely invisible. You don't see a literal open pit in the ground. You hear a compliment. You hear flattery. Someone tells you what you want to hear. You think you're walking on solid ground, engaging in a normal, pleasant conversation. But the text is warning that you're actually standing on the edge of a slippery slope leading straight down into a chasm of destructive motives.
And that ties directly back to why the psalmist needed God's providential snowplow in the previous verse. You cannot navigate a landscape filled with invisible, linguistic open graves on your own.
You'd never spot them.
Right. Human discernment isn't enough to spot a trap made of flattery. You need the active deliverance of God to level the path and reveal the traps for what they are. You need God to flatten the slope before you slip on it.
Recognizing the sheer lethality of this trap, the psalmist takes the only logical next step. If your enemies are setting physiological traps leading to Sheol, you don't just ask for a minor detour, you appeal for absolute divine justice. This brings us to verse 10, where we encounter imprecation and the call for downfall.
An imprecation is a spoken curse, or a formal call for judgment. In the translator notes, we see the text read, "Declare or regard them as guilty." The note explains that declaring the adversaries guilty is metonymic for actively judging them or paying them back for their wrongdoing.
There's that concept of metonymy again. The legal declaration of guilt in a courtroom stands in for the physical execution of the payback. The gavel drop results in the punishment, and the notes give us the grammatical engine for this request, the imprecatory jussive.
The Hebrew prefixed verbal form here is a jussive, which expresses a wish, a command, or in this specific context, an imprecation. The psalmist says, "May they fall from their plans." He is actively calling a curse of judgment down on the evildoers.
But look at the brilliant irony in the text regarding how the judgment is executed. May they fall from their plans. Their plans become the very instrument of their downfall. God judges them by allowing their own evil schemes, their own carefully constructed open graves, to collapse in on them. They dig a pit and they fall into it.
It's a phenomenal symmetry in the text's logic. The punishment is not arbitrary, it's organic to the crime. The destruction they plotted for the innocent victim becomes the exact site of their own ruin. Their own slippery tongue causes them to lose their footing.
Okay, I have to pause and raise a major tension here for the listener. In modern religious, but here, the text features a blatant imprecation, a call for destruction and payback. How does the text justify this? Doesn't this just sound like a bitter personal vendetta? If someone cuts me off in traffic, can I pray an imprecatory jussive over them?
That tension is very real, and it's addressed directly in the translator notes regarding the next phrase. The text says, "Banish them," and the note zeroes in on the specific Hebrew noun used here, pesha. This word refers to rebellious actions. The note clarifies that the psalmist pictures his enemies not merely as interpersonal rivals, but as direct rebels against God.
Oh, so it elevates the entire conflict.
It shifts the jurisdiction completely. The imprecation is not rooted in a petty personal squabble. The psalmist isn't asking God to destroy someone because they insulted his outfit or cut him off in traffic. The enemies are categorized by the word pesha as engaged in high treason against the divine order.
Treason, that's a strong word.
It is, because they are in active rebellion against God's characteristic attitude of protecting the innocent. Calling for their downfall is in alignment with God's cosmic justice, not a personal desire for petty revenge. You are asking God to uphold his own laws against high treason.
That distinction changes everything. It separates righteous imprecation from human malice. And while the wicked fall by their own rebellious plans, the text shifts gears again as we move into verses 11 and 12. It outlines the precise physical and emotional realities for those who remain loyal to the divine order.
The sharp contrasts continue. We look at the concept of taking shelter and being hemmed in by favor. The note explains the phrase, take shelter. The text says, taking shelter in the Lord is an idiom for seeking his protection.
An idiom we use all the time, even today, taking shelter from a storm.
Yes, but the translator note adds a critical theological layer to the idiom. Seeking God's protection presupposes and actually demonstrates the subject's loyalty to the Lord. You do not seek shelter in the fortress of a king you're rebelling against.
Good point.
Another note reinforces this by equating those who take shelter with the lovers of your name. The people seeking shelter are the ones who have maintained their loyalty to God, unlike the rebels we just discussed.
And for those loyal people, the text uses that jussive form again, but this time it's deployed for protection, not cursing. The notes detail the grammar of protection. The psalmist prays, put a cover over them. The note identifies this verb form as a hiphil, imperfect, from the root sakak, meaning to cover or shut off.
The hiphil stem often carries a causative sense in Hebrew. The psalmist is asking God to cause a covering to be placed over the loyal followers. The imperfect form, as we established earlier, expresses an ongoing, continuous reality. The psalmist is requesting a continuous causative covering.
But the protection isn't just an end in itself. You don't just get a heavy cover thrown over you so you can sit in the dark and be safe but miserable. The notes introduce the vav of purpose.
The Hebrew letter vav acts as a conjunction, and it is most often translated simply as and. But here, the vav is combined with a prefixed verbal form following the volitional command, shelter them. The translation note explains that this highly specific grammatical construction indicates purpose or result.
Meaning, shelter them so that something else can happen. The shelter is a prerequisite for the real goal.
Yes, the grammatical result of God's covering is so that they may rejoice. The shelter provides the necessary secure environment where genuine joy can actually occur, free from the constant terror of the open grave.
Because it's hard to be joyful when you're terrified.
Right. You cannot rejoice if you are constantly looking down to make sure you aren't stepping on a slippery slope. The covering allows the joy to flourish.
The mechanics of that massive protection are described in the final notes for Psalm 5. The text says God characteristically rewards the innocent. Again, we see the singular form used collectively for the innocent group, mirroring the man of bloodshed archetype. And the text says God will surround them with favor.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
The translators provide a fascinating cross-reference here. They point out that in 1 Samuel 23.26, this exact same Hebrew verb is used. But in 1 Samuel, it describes how King Saul and his men aggressively hemmed David in as they chased him through the wilderness.
That dual use of the word across the Old Testament highlights a radical shift in context. The verb itself describes a tactical military maneuver surrounding or hemming someone in. In 1 Samuel, being hemmed in by Saul's bloodthirsty army is a terrifying prospect. It means you're trapped. There's no escape route. The enemy has closed the circle.
It's a claustrophobic nightmare. You're being hunted like an animal. But here in Psalm 5, God takes the exact same tactical formation surrounding the subject, closing the circle and closing the spurt. He replaces the enemy soldiers with his defensive favor. A translator note explicitly states that favor here stands by metonymy for God's defensive actions. It is the distinct difference between being cornered in an alley by a hostile mob and being escorted down the street surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards.
A phalanx is an excellent visual for understanding this metonymy. God's favor is not just a warm, fuzzy sentiment in heaven. It acts as a shield wall, a heavy infantry formation that completely encircles the loyal follower, shutting off all physical and linguistic access to the enemy. The
Wow.
tactical verb that once meant utter terror for David now means absolute, impenetrable security for the psalmist.
This brings us to the close of Psalm 5, and the deep dive concludes by glancing over the edge into the immediate aftermath, looking at the very first notes for Psalm 6.
The transition from the end of Psalm 5 to the beginning of Psalm 6 is incredibly jarring. In Psalm 5, we have this climax of intense confidence. The psalmist enters the house boldly, the path is leveled by the snowplow, the enemy falls into their own trap, and the loyal are hemmed in by an impenetrable phalanx of favor. But the translator note summarizes the opening of Psalm 6 like this. The psalmist begs the Lord to withdraw his anger and spare his life.
Wait, what happened to the phalanx? What happened to the confident entry and the joy under the covering? Why is he suddenly begging for his life?
It shows the volatile reality of living in a fallen, hostile world. The theological confidence of Psalm 5 is entirely real, but it does not grant permanent emotional immunity. The psalmist still experiences moments of acute desperation where he feels the crushing weight of divine anger, illness, or severe distress. The note adds a crucial resolution, stating that after receiving a positive response from God, the psalmist then confronts his enemies and they retreat.
It implies a constant daily cycle of reliance on God's characteristic response. You don't just pray Psalm 5 once, get your phalanx, and never face a threat again. You have to constantly return to the sanctuary, constantly ask for the path to be leveled. And the final note grounds all of this intense emotional shifting in an actual physical setting. It mentions the Hebrew term sheminit.
The precise definition of sheminit is uncertain to modern scholars, but the translation notes indicate it likely refers to a particular style of music, possibly an 8-stringed instrument or a specific musical register used by the musicians.
It's a great note because it grounds it. These texts were not just private journal entries written by a lonely guy in a cave. They were corporate performances. The entire community gathered together, the musicians played the sheminit, and the people sang loudly about the phalanx of favor and the reality of the open grave. They rehearsed these massive theological truths together.
Rehearsing the grammar and the theology as a gathered community fortifies the individual believer. When you sing corporately about God's typical, continuous, characteristic response to violence, it shapes how you view the threats in your own private life. It tunes your mind to reality.
And tuning our minds to the reality of the text is what this deep dive has been all about. We've unpacked some intense linguistic mechanics today. We looked at how metonymy uses the concept of fear to describe the necessary catalyst for worship, and how it uses favor to describe a defensive kinetic phalanx.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We examined the imprecatory jussive forms calling down judgment so that enemies fall organically by their own plans. We pulled back the curtain on the Masoretic scribes with the Ker and Kithy marginal notes, showing how meticulously the text was preserved through centuries of copying. And we visualized the gruesome anatomical metaphor of the open grave, where flattery is the slope and the throat is the chasm.
The sheer density of the source material highlights how precisely the ancient text was constructed. Every pronoun, every verb tense, every marginal note works together to convey massive theological realities about God's justice and his protection.
Which leaves us with a final thought to consider before we wrap up. The text claims that the wicked's own motives and flattering words act as a slippery slope leading directly into an open grave. Think about the media, the flattery, and the millions of words you consume on a daily basis. How often do you evaluate the literal inward motives of the voices you listen to on your screens? Are the words you absorb acting as a snowplow, leveling your path, or are they quietly digging a slope toward ruin? It's a stark biological warning from antiquity. Not every path is solid ground, and sometimes stepping onto a smooth tongue means stepping into the dark. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.